Chapter 2 Year 874 PXF Early Summer. Dawn broke across the rocks and surf of the Uldani Isles, the summer sun having barely skirted below the horizon for a scant 6 hours. The shining glow of morning lightened Osmond's eyelids, pulling him out of a sleep that had swung like a pendulum from deep restoration to restless torment, as his time in captivity below the halls of judgment refused to be exorcised from his subconscious. Even after Osmond had gathered his things and tarried among the tide pools, the hour at which he set out for Horizon's End was still painfully early by any standard other than that of bakers and the most diligent farmers. Heading along the shore sorely tempted Osmond, where he would eventually come to the fortified port city of Cinderfall. Even though diplomats ended the war with the Empire a century and a half ago, the port still proudly displayed its battle scars. It bustled with the many Uldani who were unable or unwilling to leave the war behind them, and craved the emotional addictions that were Cinderfall's hallmark at the height of the Zalian conflict. Osmond knew months or years could slip by, perhaps even his whole exile, if he dived deep into the keel provided there. While tempted by the excuse it offered to change his destination, Cinderfall's siren call did not sway Osmond from his path. As much as he dreaded it, he turned inland, toward the cliffs and mountains where Horizon's End lay. Most who walked the panoramic trail leading to Horizon's End would spend hours engulfed by the keel of the sheer thrilling wonder it presented around every twist and turn. They would amble awestruck by the towering cliffs bisected by arrays of waterfalls, high verdant meadows filled with carpets of shimmering wildflowers, tranquil grottos with secret burbling brooks, and valleys as still as a cathedral, made silent by towering sentinel evergreens. The journey could take days for some, unable to keep from stopping and gorging themselves on the tactile cornucopia their keel distilled from the majesty surrounding them. These same vistas had called his father here over 3.5 centuries ago, each scene along the meandering path washing away the emotional onslaught of the war that harrowed his every moment within the sprawl, heat, and ash of Maelisari. Architavia Thorandus, Farseer of the Argutheris, holy champion and shaman of Tamilvigos the Living Breeze, built his sanctuary and home high atop the cliffs that marked the eastern ridge of the Isle of Invenora. While the proper name of his refuge was Sornatok, or Where the Sky Dies when accurately translated from the Old Tongue, modern romantics and admirers of Osmond's father had softened the name into Horizon's End. Long before Osmond's father became known as the Farseer, a shaman, or holy in any sense of the word, he was simply Architavia, and most just called him Tavi. At that time, predating everything his future held for him, Tavi, a child of the war, had been an artist. When the rest of Uldani society had embraced the tumultuous flood of righteous anger, patriotism, and sacrifice that accompanied the war, Tavi had fled to the wondrous beauty of the mountains to try and capture their timeless hope and a dream of peace. For Osmond, any keel from the spectacle of the familiar vistas that so inspired his father did not exist. He might as well have been walking through a barren landscape without features or interest. It wasn't that he had grown bored of it from dozens of times traversing this path, or had never felt its soaring joy in his heart. He once had. Osmond had done the unthinkable, a sin and transgression of the highest order to all Uldani. 8 years ago, when he left his father and Sornatok behind him, he severed all his emotions tied to this place in a ritual most Uldani considered akin to self-mutilation. Osmond had no idea what kind of reception he might encounter at Horizon's End. Only 3 months had passed since word of his father's death had reached him, and as such, it was well within the mourning period observed by many, but also, enough time had transpired that the Alinari, a ritual celebration of an Uldani's life, could be in full swing. If the denizens of Horizon's End were true to form, both could be happening simultaneously. In the century following the Zalian War's end, a revolving cavalcade of artists and visitors passed through Horizon's End. By Osmond's birth, their encampments had littered the property, with dozens of newer structures spread around the cliffside thermal pools, towering evergreens, and glacial streams. The commune's population could swell to over 50 residents in the spring and summer months, and dwindle to less than a dozen during the dark, frigid winters. The ever-changing cast of inhabitants created both a wonderland and a warped dystopia for a young child. With his birth parents absent throughout his childhood and early adolescence, Osmond had a rotating gallery of caregivers who raised him, none of whom seemed to linger more than a season or two. The likelihood of finding a familiar face, much less someone he trusted enough to try and begin untangling the last decades of his father's life, was slim. Even during the 18 years he had lived at Horizon's End, there were less than a handful of guests that returned regularly, and those that did flit through the enclave like an errant breeze. When Osmond reached the outskirts of his father's home, the sun was low in the sky, its ruddy orb threatening to present yet another once-in-a-lifetime sunset of stunning vibrancy and magnificence. The current residents of Horizon's End had all gathered outside as always. They filled the common areas around the main lodge and outbuildings to feast on the keel inspired by the spectacle nature would serve up for the evening. Osmond spotted many still wearing ice blue, the color of mourning inherited from the time before the Uldani split from their elven cousins. But others had already donned the blazing scarlet, orange, and yellows of the Alinari. To Osmond, the jumbled dichotomy of the rituals was a disappointing reminder of his rudderless childhood, subjected to the fickle whims of any caregiver who decided to take him on as a project and drift into his life for a time. Obscured by the dark silhouette he presented against the bright western sky, Osmond examined the crowd and saw only strangers. As his identity resolved, a wave of discomfort rippled across the gathering as Keel manifested in those who had spotted him. Some wrapped their cloaks more tightly around their shoulders. Others fidgeted, as though their clothes were suddenly made from crawling ants. A few shifted their feet as though needing to catch their balance on a swaying ship. At least 2 gifted with empathic resonance turned and retched, unable to hold back their nausea at sensing the after-effects of the ritual he had performed upon himself. For those who did not already know of him, Osmond's identity spread quickly among those gathered. There were any number of reasons for him not to be welcome here at his father's home. Whether it be judgment, pity, disgust, empathy, hatred, dismissal, or even a thirst for the drama he might cause, every eye and posture held a message for Osmond. Even so, no one approached or stopped him as he crossed the courtyard. The sea of unmasked emotions and whispers of derision parted to allow him to pass. Osmond traversed the bald stone of the compound and entered the main lodge. None followed. For the gathered crowd, a more critical experience was at hand. The sun had started its show, and a wayward sun's return could be confronted later. Osmond was not surprised that the lodge's main room had been rearranged again, the same as it had always done every season when he was a boy. A few pieces of decor and furniture were familiar, but most were new and unmatched, all individually added without concern or care to the overall aesthetic. Osmond crossed the great room to the hallway that led to a single destination: his father's chambers. As was the custom, the lintel above the door had been marked with ice blue ink, effectively sealing the room from prying eyes or sticky fingers until the period of grief and mourning was complete. Having little reverence for the tradition of his people or his father, Osmond did not let the mark stop him. He opened the unlocked door without hesitation or emotion and stepped across the threshold. Breaking the mourning protocol, he locked the door behind him. Architavia Thorandus's suite of rooms was a residence unto itself within the larger main lodge, much of it comprised of the original abode his father had built before additions and expansion had created the main building of Horizon's End as it now existed. These rooms had been Osmond's one constant in his childhood, including their current state of housing only echoes of his father, and not the man himself. 20 years earlier. Year 854 PXF. Late autumn. Osman was ecstatic. Perched on his knees, looking over the back of the couch at the door, his small form vibrated with anticipation as he waited. His father, the man he only knew from the stories he diligently read, then had fought and struggled to remember, even though every adult said it was folly even to try, was coming home. Osman knew his dad had left less than a year after his birth on an Omanara, a fated journey. Now, 6 years later, he was returning. Osman never knew his mother and had no memory of her. Adults at Horizon's End whimsically teased him that at every introduction from as soon as he learned the word, he had asked each person he met, male or female, if they were his mother. For reasons Osman never understood, the storyteller would add with a ruffle of his hair as though it was some excellent jest, "Well, and of course, none of them were." Osman's current caretaker was a genial and ruggedly handsome sculptor named Anson. He had been looking after Osman for the last 2 years while he painstakingly worked on a towering sculpture carved out of a single ironwood log as tall as the grand hall of the lodge. He even showed Osman how to use a wood chisel and gifted him a small one with a dulled edge to practice with. When Osman asked Anson why he sculpted instead of painting like everyone else at Horizon's End, the sculptor stopped his work and squatted down in front of Osman.
A painting is an experience for your eyes where the artist guides you into seeing only what they saw and how they saw it.
Looking up at his massive project, he continued reverently.
A sculpture is the sharing of a memory, real or imagined, for each person to view from their own perspective. You can change your experience with light and angle and even time.
Anson lifted Osman with his strong arms to reach and touch the area he had been sanding.
Or decide to see it without using your eyes at all.
Anson's words ignited Osman's creativity, especially after his precocious struggle with committing the stories in the Zalian books about his father to memory over the past year. Osman wanted to create a sculpture of something unique, like Anson was doing with the ironwood tree out behind the lodge. However, being just shy of 7 years old, he couldn't think of anything special he had experienced personally. 2 days later, an idea came to him, but he didn't know where to start. That morning at breakfast, as Anson pulled roasted mushrooms out of the oven, Osman asked,
"How do you sculpt an idea?"
Well, ideas can be the easiest and hardest,
Anson mused.
The slightest impression or infinite details can represent them. Often what matters is context.
What's context?
Osman asked innocently.
Context is what's not necessarily in the sculpture, but what's around it or the experiences that inform or created it.
Anson explained in a knowing, patient tone that Osman recognized as him preparing for all his further questions.
Oh,
Osman replied sagely. Osman always liked that Anson patiently waited for him to think and ask his questions before returning to his adult things. But this time, Osman had heard all he needed to hear, so he finished his breakfast and headed to his room with determination. He could feel Anson's eyes following him, but his caretaker did not call him back suspiciously like most adults when he set his mind to something. Anson just remained sitting at the table, sipping his coffee. Once in his room, Osman retrieved the wood chisel gifted to him by his current guardian and prepared to begin his first sculpture, which he might never finish, but he hoped he would not have to continue to work on beyond today. There was one thing Osman knew was unique about him from his books. He didn't have his father or mother raising him. He lifted his chisel to the log that ran over the head of his bed and made a single deep vertical mark. That was Anson. Biting his tongue and squinching up his face, he put 2 more slashes to the left of Anson's. They were context, the 2 caretakers that had come before Anson that he had fleeting memories of. He knew there were probably more prior to that, but including them felt like a lie, since he couldn't remember them at all. The gouges in the wood were just to the left of the bed. That way, Osman would see them as he went to sleep each night, and again when he woke up each morning. the light catching them differently and the angle changing as he moved from standing to sitting to prone. Almost 7-year-old Osmond smiled at his first sculpture, not realizing the pain it would indelibly capture over the next decade. Present year, 874 PXF. Early summer. The central room of Tavi's residence seemed to have been locked in amber for the 8 years he had been away. Osmond spotted the same tattered knit blanket he grew up with, haphazardly thrown over the back of the ancient broken-in couch that faced away from the door. Heavy curtains covered the curved bay of windows across from it, hiding the most envied view in all of Horizon's End. The same unfinished painting, a representation of dawn breaking upon the cliffs beyond the covered window, sat on an easel adjacent to the closed curtains. It had remained frozen in the identical position and state of completion as it was from Osmond's earliest memory. It was the only painting, finished or otherwise, in the abode outside his father's studio, whose door stood unlatched beyond the easel. The collected mementos from Architavia Thorandus's life before Osmond still perched on every surface and clung to every nook. They were as unchanged as the hand-laid, stacked stone walls that transitioned to rough-hewn logs as they climbed toward the open rafters of the ceiling. Each room differed as to where that boundary between stone and tree lay, based on his father's aesthetic or whim as he built Horizon's End. If there was some secret behind its meaning, Osmond had never been able to decipher it. Osmond drifted around the rooms, disconnected from the nostalgia or sentiment any living being would have in the same circumstance. In the small kitchen, he recognized the iron kettle from his childhood hanging near the hearth, and the memory of smoky male Isari spices haunted the air. His father's bedchamber was still dominated by the deep featherbed Osmond had crawled into alone many times as a child to pretend his father was home. Across the living space and down an awkward hallway lay the one addition to Architavia Thorandus's rooms since its original construction. The door was closed, and the hinges creaked deeply, as though they had not once been exercised in the time he had been away. Unlike the rest of his father's residence, within Osmond's bedroom, dust lay deeply over his belongings. Where time had seemed to have stopped elsewhere in his former home, here it seemed to have raced forward in a sprint. His once cherished books were scattered across the floor. The quickly constructed shelves on which he had meticulously stored them as a child had finally buckled like a ship's keel broken on the rocks, its cargo spilling across a foreign shore. The bed seemed laughably small after the relative luxury of his bed and the beds he had shared in Arnador. The bedclothes and quilt that laid upon it sagged from time and weight. The stitching and fabric stretched like weary flesh too long of this world. To the left of the bed, just above the height of the headboard, was his first and last sculpture, the log with 21 crudely carved hash marks Osmond had made there. The light that weakly penetrated through the threadbare curtains was fading, and the weariness of the long trek from the shore hit Osmond. Combined with his time in captivity and the fully healed but still aching wound from Talon's dagger, exhaustion landed on him heavily, almost making him swoon. For every other of his kin, this room would have been filled with a banquet of Keel. For Osmond, it had no more sustenance than a rented room that an innkeeper had over-decorated with personal items. Dropping his pack to the floor, Osmond lay down with the corpse of his childhood on the too small bed and slept.